All right, so we have a very warm welcome to guest co-host Anwar Uhuru, who's joining us today to chat for this part two, the sequel to Alfonso's wonderful piece, "To Be or Not to Be: Blackness and Signification." So we're gonna continue from where we left off last episode, and hopefully, I don't know if we'll be able to finish it this time, but we'll try. Because we talk a lot in between, but that's good, you know.
Yeah,
Yeah.
definitely.
So, Alfonso, you get to start. I think we pick up from "I'm approaching," and we'll take it from there.
All right, sounds good. I am approaching farcical territory where no one will take me seriously, but there is a method to my madness. Dissociating from the semiotic system I've been born into means incorporating a signification, sign functioning, as opposed to sign identity, into my framework. This is partially supplemented in splitting subjective enunciations. Gary Janosco defines asignification, quote, in its most general sense, as any semiotic that dissociates itself in some manner from a meaning component or considers meaning to be an irritant, close quotes. Note the irony of the word irritant with regard to, quote, black as a categorizing pejorative. What black means as definition and how it syntactically operates can be separated into the following domains. Signification equals identity, asignification equals function. Signification regards a sign's identity and its empirical referent. When I say I am not black, the signifying component extracts my personal identity from the context.
All right, so that's a heavy one.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, basically, all that's really happening here is I'm going into um, how to split signification apart from itself. So, a lot of the time, either on social media or whatever, I'm always talking about the split between identity and how identity functions. They're not synonymous, and they do operate in independent ways. So they're almost two different formations of the same univocal source of what is signification. So you have the identity part, the the aesthetic surface, if you will, um, that presents itself to other people and to the world. But then you also have the way that it functionally and structurally operates. So, for example, um, I'm looking at a whole bunch of boxes here. So you have this thing that is called a box. The boxes can take a lot of different shapes. So when you go to U-Haul, you go to the box section and you see a lot of different types of boxes of all different sizes, and they're a very diverse bunch. So you cannot necessarily say that all boxes are the same. Um, Yet at the same time, um, the function of these boxes is to serve a very specific and particular purpose. They are containers to hold things, to move things, to make things mobile from one location to the other. Um, Now, just because we walk into U-Haul and see these similar but very different types of boxes doesn't necessarily mean that um, they either have to only look like what we see in U-Haul or necessarily function in that particular way. If I wanted to, I could take one of those boxes and use it as a sort of makeshift table, turn it upside down and put stuff on it, and use it in a way that it was not intended. So even the function can serve or serve a different role other than what has been intended for it. So um, so in elaborating this and making this distinction, we're qualifying that um, signification is not a one size fits all, and that even the way that we propose to use it through language um, is not it's just not, again, one size fits all. We'll just put it that way. So so with regard to Blackness, I'm trying to separate the box that I've been put in upon coming into the world, with how people use it and use me inside of that box. So I come into the world, I'm birthed through my mother, um, and people look at me, and immediately there are any number of assumptions that are made about me based on things that I already don't know about. My parents, living conditions, up to the point of my birth. Who they are as individuals, their personalities, um, the state of events that occurred in the hospital, what's immediately going to happen after when they take me home, um, and then from there, starting my acculturation and development into the world. Um, so people will be looking at me a particular way, and then from that, they'll be making certain assumptions about how I'm supposed to operate in the world, who I might be, the things that I like, uh, and so on. Um, but these things they're not concrete. They're shiftable, they're contingent, because I'm an individual. I'm a particular subjectivity that's moving about in the world, in a very particular way. And just because these signifiers are out there, um, doesn't mean that they necessarily have to stick to me, in that sort of predetermined way. So that's sort of what this paragraph is alluding to. And I really want to highlight, Gary Janosko. So I'm always very appreciative of Gary and his material, because he deals a lot with Felix Guattari, um, and I think especially in the English language material on Guattari, because I don't unfortunately read French. I wish it was a lot better.
Mm,
Um, but he has done quite a bit of research, and put out a lot of research on him, and I utilize his work, daily. So I'm very appreciative of Gary's work. So I
mhm.
just wanted to put that out there.
So let me see if I get this correctly. Um, so are you saying that identity is more fixed, but function is more fluid and, in a sense, more liberatory as a result of that?
Um,
Or are you
no,
saying the opposite?
no. Actually, well, let me tell you what happened. So after I wrote this article, um, I think I might have mentioned this in the last episode a little bit, but after I wrote this article, I went back to trying to understand Lacan's formulas of sexuation, because prior to that, I didn't have an understanding. But also in another, the Vancouver Lacan Salon group, we were going through Lacan's seminar 19, Upir, and we had just sort of come out of discussing that towards the end of the seminar. And as a result of trying to read that up until the point that we discussed it, um, I think some things just sort of clicked, not necessarily in the way that Lacan intended it, but as usual, my brain just sort of shot off and went left, and then I sort of took that and ran with it, and I came up with a different understanding, um, which made sense to me with what I was trying to do in my sphere. So what ended up happening was I ended up splitting. So he splits his graph between masculinity and femininity, um, but I ended up splitting inner experience from identity. So inner experience is, for me, it's it's the core center of the subject that only they can experience. It is what is absolutely unique to them. At the same time, um, it's not something that you have direct access to. You have access to it by living and by memory. Now, if you take both of those away, then there's a serious problem. Definitely, if you're not living, because you definitely won't have access to memory. Um, but memory, the empirical part of memory, that housed in your brain, when that is corrupted, as we see through certain biogenetic degradations like Alzheimer's, when that is corrupted, then the subjects experience within to themselves and the world and the environment in general um, is can become very distorted. So in this type of way, when we think about inner experience, um, it's almost like what Graham Harman references in his object-oriented ontology about the core of an object being sort of untouchable, in a way. Um, so that is what that is. Now, for us as people, what that means is we come into the world, we acculturate, we develop, um, and as a result of moving through this tunnel of experience, we learn as subjects and beings to express ourselves because that's just what we do as subjectivities and human consciousnesses. Um, so this is where the identity part comes in. So the identity for me is always malleable. It's
Hmm.
always shiftable and contingent and always reacting between subjectivity and the environment in this sort of reciprocal manner. It's not something that can necessarily be pinned down even to the subject, um, regardless of how much they might feel it to be. So they might feel themselves to be, Republican or Democrat or um, Indonesian or American or whatever signifier they feel they want to attach to to themselves. Um, it's not necessarily that they can't or don't relate to that. It's the fact that this can be questionable. It can be questioned both by themselves and externally. So
Hmm.
somebody else in encountering me can pose the question, but then I also to myself voluntarily and involuntarily, again through certain degradations of the body, um, I can become sort of unknown to myself, or I can decide, say, the signifier becomes stigmatized in a way that I don't necessarily desire, and I want to dissociate myself from that signifier.
Hmm.
In that voluntary sense, I can consciously make a move away from that signifier and, drift towards something else if I want to.
Okay.
So in
And would
that
that
way,
would that be a signification? Because you're kind of disconnecting from the signification.
um, it, we could say that. We could say that the act of drifting away from that stigmatized signifier towards another one uh, would be um, would be a conscious act of shifting its function. We could say,
Okay. I have
um,
more questions. I want to see if Anwar
for
has a
sure.
comment or question. So please go ahead, Anwar.
No, I'm really chewing on this idea of malleability too that you present. And I
Hmm.
think that's one way to think about asignification because if, for example, race, gender are social constructions, then it does push that notion of malleability or to asignify something because society can have its own construct narrative of one's place or
Hmm.
being, but the individual who then pushes back on that and says no, I actually gravitate towards this, then it forces a malleability. But my question would be, is one who is identified as Black, even if they don't identify as Black, are they allowed to be malleable in terms of like individual or collective agency?
Personally, I would say absolutely yes. So within the sphere of the individual, they always have that choice within themselves to make that decision. That's not a decision that somebody else can make for them. Um, so I'll also say here that between inner experience and identity, what bridges the communicable connection for the subject is language. Now, language is not the only thing, but language is a very specific type of discourse. Is a very specific type of discourse that, for the human subject, takes has more weight than others. So, for example, if we want to contrast, speech versus body language. Now, I mean, we know both operate in very powerful ways, but there are certain things that body language cannot do that language can do. For example, we can, in reference to technology, if mechanical parts, they cannot be labeled with body language. They require labels with letters that are signifiers and all that sort of thing. And language sort of brings into itself a lot of different tangible and intangible elements and certain kinds of relations that is just not possible through the perception of seeing another thing as a particular subject. So while we want to recognize the very specificity and particular function of language, at the same time, in a Deleuzian and Guattarian type of way, we don't want to say it's the only, but for our purposes of discussing the link between inner experience and identity, we want to say that this is a sort of primary link. So with this establishment of language as being the bridge for the subject between their inner experience and how they express this inner experience through identity, when language is severely handicapped, I want to say that the subject sort of operates in a kind of, we'll say, subjective autism, not necessarily the biogenetic form of autism that we are all familiar with, but subjectivity becomes put in a space where it can't operate the way it conventionally would through language. So, for example, if we can take the biblical example of Adam. What would have been Adam's role in the Judeo-Christian tradition, if in assembling all those animals to go on the ark, what if he had not been able to name any of them? Because it's not just a question of the animals in themselves, it's the whole genealogy from Adam all the way through the entire biblical tradition. So
we're talking Noah though, right? Not Adam.
Yeah.
Just okay.
Sorry. But yeah, so without the ability to name a thing, without the ability to put any kind of enunciation or to stick an enunciation or label on any phenomenon whatsoever, that has the great potential to produce a great deal of anxiety, an anxiety that can't necessarily be released, because what do? You know, you're left with vocalizations and utterings in a very real sense that don't make any sense. So um, so language is the bridge between these two fields. So you have inner experience, which is localized to the subject, and then you have the identity, which is the aesthetic expression. But but this relationship is not. It's still problematic. So um,
Okay, so I want to kind of add to something that Anwar said, like the question of malleability, because for
sure,
me, this term identity, I mean, always, going back to psychoanalysis, it's rooted in identification, right?
right,
Identity is based on certain identifications that we have with others, with things, with ideas, and those
yeah,
identifications basically lead to our identities, right? And
right,
these identifications are essentially social in many ways. And so, the question of identity when it's as opposed to identification, that's why I asked you about the question of fixity, because I asked you if identity is fixed and function is more fluid, or you can say malleable.
yeah,
And I'm thinking of opacity too here, Edward,
mhm,
you saw. Um, so that's a question, because actually it reminded me of recent talk with Boots Riley, where he was talking about how there's this tension between, you know, he even had a problem identifying with being called an organizer, because yes, he has organized, he has supported organizing, but he's not always organizing, and sometimes
right,
he's just an artist who's making
yeah,
films or music. And so he had this reflexivity, critical reflexivity about um, identifying as an artist, sometimes as an organizer, but seeing the function of the artist structurally as kind of a bourgeois thing. So that he was realizing this contradiction, and he's making anti-capitalist um, products in a capitalist system, right? And
right.
so there's this tension that I think he beautifully kind of, this is what I thought about in terms of this tension between identity and function. And I'm wondering which side you think is more liberating. And for me, would be the side that would be less fixed, because if it has more malleability in a sense, we have more options to explore, and more possibilities. So that's one question. The other question is that came to me is why use the term or phrase inner experience as opposed to experience? Just like, and this is kind of the phenomenologist in me asking this question, because what's the point of adding the word inner? Like, is an experience kind of like involves the inner aspect and has to be somehow connected to the social environment as well, right?
Um, okay, I'll address the identification split first. Identification is something that human subjects, unfortunately slash unfortunately, have to do. It's just a natural part of their ontology. The way we acculturate and move about in the world, we have to have models to sort of know who we are and who we aren't. So as we grow, um, we're constantly surveying our environment to see what we what we do desire, what we don't desire, and the consequences of that desiring um, within the greater context of the environments that we move in. So identification is a function that has to happen. Um, Now, the result of that identification, which is the identity, um, is the very malleable part. So you might choose um, to hang with a certain group that does particular things and labels themselves a particular kind of a way. But then we may grow out of that later on and decide to hang with a different group of people. So the subject always has the personal ability to alter their identification as they choose, according to how they choose to move and who they choose to be around, and so on. Um, as far as why inner experience, um, so for me, subjectivity is not, it's not necessarily tied specifically to human subjects. So this is where, Graham Harmon's work for me, really has an impact. So diversifying subjectivity towards non-anthropocentric phenomena means that, again, for me, subjectivity is a matrix. It is a a it's a point within a matrix that cannot necessarily be inhabited by something else um, within a particular environment. So the most literal example would be just people or things. So I'm a subject. This phone sitting here is a subject. This pen sitting here is a subject. They're subjects because they're in this sort of space-time environment existing um, in counterposition to me. So I'm not in the position of this pen being this pen in the way it is right here. So this pen has subjectivity in the same way that I do, is me existing here, right here and right now. Now, the fact that this pen is not conscious is irrelevant for the point of subjectivity. Um, we focus on our subjectivity and we sort of globalize that because we're a very particular kind of subjectivity, which is a human being that is conscious and can do specific things that other types of consciousness subjectivities cannot do. So I can do things that, for example, a bear cannot do. Um, I have certain mobile capacities that allow me to take ideas from my brain, execute them in the world, and meditate on them and create uh, media and environments and technologies uh, that do other things that I cannot do. So, in this sort of redundant and self replicative way, I can create other subjectivities, not myself, but can do things that I cannot do. So, it's a weird, it's a strange type of relationship, but that's what I can do as a type of subjectivity that I am as a human consciousness. Um, but so the purpose of labeling it inner experience is to sort of highlight the non-communicability of the the phenomenon in that subjective space. So it's not, I can't communicate my personal experience to you directly, right? I can't possess you, you can't possess me directly. Um, so there's an ontological barrier that cannot be crossed. So this is important for experience and acculturation in the world because nobody else can move in the world like I do. The way that I move as soon as I'm born, you know, is unique to me. Now, there may be other people who move in similar environments as me, but as we know, um, heterogeneity is real. So just because we phenomenologically label certain things as the same, this is a simplification that we use for ourselves to better understand. So when we go into a factory or we go into a store and we see the same product lined up one after another, conventionally we say that these are the same, but they are not the same. They can all be damaged and handled independently, and there might be, like, if we were to scale ourselves down to micro levels, we might see all types of imperfections and um, distortions in the surface from one object to the next. So that's not something that we conventionally think of because it's not part of our conventional thinking protocol, but it's very real. Um, so there's a difference between that type of simplification and the real effects at the ontological level. So I really try and separate that differentiation. Um,
That reminds me of I don't know if you ever got a chance to look into this, but the difference between phenomenology and phenomenography. So, phenomenology tries to look at the essence or structure of an experience, so the things in common. So, when we say the experience of falling in love, like
mm,
ask different people, what is that like? And they'll give you different answers, but you're trying to find out what is the common thing between all these different answers. So, obviously, you're ignoring the differences. You're interested in the differences. And phenomenography, as opposed to phenomenology, looks at those differences as opposed to the similarities or the essence of an experience. So that's something that comes to mind when I hear that. Anwar,
interesting.
it looks like you had some thoughts you wanted to add here.
No, I thought that correlation between phenomenology and phenomenography is really interesting, especially whenever I read phenomenology, I always ask whose phenomenology are we talking about,
Right,
right?
right.
Especially when we think about the quote unquote four parents of phenomenology, I think, oh, that's great for white people, but what does that mean outside of
Absolutely.
a white construct? I mean, when we think about racial construction, especially the people you cite in your article, to even be considered a subject is already like a huge undertaking, and then to
Yeah,
think of to be a phenomenon takes on a whole other level of brevity and depth. So, what did I write down? Because you mentioned like when we think of being a human or a human subject, it's a particular subjectivity that you mentioned. And
yeah,
so I think of us here in the US, we are all living a particular subjectivity,
right.
which is unique unto itself. Um, so, with that said, um, now more than ever, I mean, we're literally a few days away from an election. So, our
Mhm.
particular subjectivity will probably go through. Both an individual and a social construction of a malleable self, right?
Yeah,
So, and you got at this earlier, but I wanted to tease out more about is this kind of an inner turmoil to have one's own inner expression versus the external expression that's imposed on someone? So, therefore, Robert got at this earlier where he was saying that the difference between inner expression and expression. So, like, uh, when we think of Black folks with the legacy of slavery, for example, we weren't there during slavery. So, that expression is kind of like an imposed one as opposed to an actually experienced one. And
right.
even we think about state sanctioned violence. That's not necessarily one's individual experience, but it's the one which it's socially imposed on someone. And of course, we know with trauma, one doesn't have to necessarily experience it, but just in some way bear witness to it. So, so my question is, does the social kind of imposition of expression work against one's own ability to have an inner expression is kind of where I'm teasing out. So, so I think that's kind of where I wanted to go with that because I'm thinking about like how expression is, malleable, and we talked about that earlier. But like, is that basically what I'm trying to get at? How much of it, I guess you could say, is authentic versus imposed is really what I'm trying to get at. Like, yeah, so
Yeah,
yeah, how much of it is authentic and how much of it is kind of imposed or kind of like secondary, tertiarily, truly experienced, if you will.
If I
got you.
may add shortly, that tension between the authenticity and what's imposed upon oneself from society, does that relate to the identity function distinction? Because I want us to be concrete about that.
Yeah, it relates to both. So maybe the best way to talk about this would be through like Rachel Dolezal and
Mm.
her similar ilk.
Hmm.
So so what she wants to do is be she wants to inhabit the identity and inner experience of those who are labeled Black. I would say that the way she goes about it is I didn't understand that. Ooh, hold on 1 second.
Siri doesn't get it.
Don't understand that. That's the fundamental problem, is that Siri does not understand that.
Oh goodness.
And
Um,
subjectivity.
yeah, yeah. Um, yeah, the way she went about it, she cannot authentically inhabit what she wants. So, for example, so focusing on the inner experience part, it's one thing to grow up in an environment with Black people. It's another thing to also inhabit the signifiers that would be associated with them as both as individuals and as groups. Um, so already at that level, even if she said that, she grew up in the same neighborhood as a lot of Black folk and had a lot of Black friends, um, the way that she would still be labeled at the aesthetic level on the surface um, would be different because people are going to look at her because physically she looks very different from other Black people, even maybe from other light skinned Black folk. They're not going to label her the same. So already she's missing out on those significations. Now, experientially, she may have experienced some of the same types of hardships in terms of, class, um, and some of those other things. Um, that would be authentic to her. Those types of experiences, the way that she experienced it, um, that would be completely authentic, and nobody could play her for that. But moving on to the level of identity, there's no way there's no way that she could make that transformational shift of what she already is external to inhabit that at the level of expression. So even if she, did all the stuff to look like a stereotypical Black woman would, it's still only at the aesthetic surface level. She's still lacking the inner experience associated with that signification, but also with with that fundamental base of inner experience, putting on the identity layer is it's like it's inauthentic. It's just categorically false. So there's no way for her to do that. So because she's because she, like everybody else, is operating within a signifying environment the way that we normally do as subjects um, in the world, there would be no way for her to get out of that um, experience signifying experience that's tied to um, who she is at her core. So we're not yet really talking about like her personality and the psychological aspect. We're purely talking about her function as a subject within a particular environment with certain kinds of attached significations, and how those significations are perceived and interpreted by other subjects, who then make further interpretations and valuations on her subjectivity. So we're purely like talking about um, how these identities work at a functional level, apart from who she is as a person at the psychological level.
And you're talking
So
specifically about like the function of her as a white subject and what that does to her identification with blackness, because there's that tension, right?
yeah, so unfortunately, because of the way that whiteness is perceived in the world, her her inhabitation of blackness, is this sort of temporary covering or hat or clothing or garb or whatever, however you want to put it. Um, when she retreats from that, she may experience some scorn or derision from some folks, but she'll be able to go back and live, a semi, regular life as a white person, relatively, again, depending on who she's around. Um, but because of the way blackness is perceived, there's no way for that inversion of subjectivity to happen. I can't just throw on whiteness. I would have to be a very particular, I would have to present a very specific kind of way aesthetically. So like literally in skin color, I would have to be more white. And then on top of that, I would have to inhabit some very specific types of significations. I would have to alter my language, the tone of my language,
Yeah.
the certain idiosyncrasies, and I would have to go through and check a whole lot of boxes to make sure that there's a point by point match of what I'm perceiving to be whiteness as, and I'll know that by how they receive me when I encounter them. So if
I'm
all those
remembering
boxes,
like Boots Riley's "Sorry to Bother You," the white voice, right?
Yeah.
yeah, 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 man.
So
So
just to like wrap up here, and we'll try to move forward, and hopefully to get as many paragraphs as possible. Clearly, a very rich paragraph. That's why we
Oh
have a
yeah.
lot
right,
of questions.
Yeah.
But I mean, in her case, Rachel Dolezal, there's this tension that I see like between identification and racialization. She is, as someone that grew up white, she was never racialized, as black, and so for her, blackness is a fantasy. Ultimately, it's like an exotic identity that she wants to occupy, which is very much like the imperial fantasy of like colonizing, Africa and Asia and different parts of the world, and getting a sense of what that experience is like. It's totally from this orientalist perspective, right? And
right,
so she can change how she looks like, because of that identification, and then experience racializing after that fact. But she can't change the fact that she grew up not experiencing racialization, and that experience really shapes one,
yeah,
to because and it has to do a lot with you not choosing to experience that.
yeah,
Like as you said, like you, it's just kind of, there's a facticity to it, right? The world is hostile, the world is racist, and that's the way it is. So there's not a lot of choice, and you just have to negotiate knowing that that's the world you live
yeah.
in, right?
Now, right now, I will say that what she did do. Um, so this is one. This is sort of it presents as empathy, but one of the ways that a subject can work their way out of uh, a type of signification is through imagination. So, using imagination, she tried to virtually uh, think about what it would be like to be a black woman and all of the associated thoughts with that. So, imagination played a critical role into how she came to present herself to the world as she did. Um, so inner experience is singular to the subject, but subjects like human consciousness have a particular faculty for imagination. And imagination is like the wormhole out of experience. So even though I can't directly communicate my experience to you or yours to mine, um, I can virtually, so the virtual level is not real necessarily in the world. It's a projection, we can say. So I can imagine what it might be like for you in whatever particular space, and then use that to inform my epistemology of myself and you, and then create some type of empathetic relation that can be used to bridge how we communicate. So, yeah, I want to say that's very important, and that's what we do that actually um, at the everyday level. So this is essentially how empathy works. Empathy is the passive virtual bridge because we cannot communicate our experiences directly with one another. Without this capacity for virtualization, or which would manifest as empathy, then the world would be nothing but chaos.
She can experience empathy and be in solidarity with Black people in the struggle without pretending to be Black. I think this is an important point, right?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So, moving on, Anwar, would you like to read the next paragraph? And in the comments in between, just because we spent 50 minutes on the first paragraph,
Oh wow.
so if we can do like a quick version of like questions and answers, that would be great.
Sure.
So just the short one.
Yeah.
The one that begins with
Yeah,
a signification.
okay.
Do you want to do the next two just so?
Yeah, that's what I was
Yeah.
asking. Yeah.
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I think that would be good.
Asignification shifts the sign's focus away from identity toward its function within the operating structure. The asignifying component completely negates any associations of Blackness from my signifying character. Not only am I beyond the contextual statement, but the negative associations of Blackness in society are equally inapplicable. Unconsciously, unconsciously, all irony intended, Lacan has a short dialogue with Marshall McLuhan in his infamous Écrit. On the basis of Lacan's statement, the utilitarianism of McLuhan's The Medium as a Message brings the nature of language to the fore regarding its aesthetic usage in expressing knowledge and actions. McLuhan himself insists, for the message of any medium or technology is a change of scale or pace or pattern that it introduces into the human affairs. Returning to Lacan, when he says the unconscious is structured like a language, the identity function split destabilizes language's cogency and reliability to demonstrate the statement's autonomy and agency apart from the subject's spoken desire. If language cannot be relied on to enunciate clearly that which it speaks on, much less speak to the nature of fact and truth, then the Cartesian cogito structuring our world begins to fall apart. The breakdown between a statement's elements and how these elements collectively form a specific meaning becomes so ambiguous as to be nearly unintelligible. Language, as an unclear medium, generates the message of confusion. In I am not Black, the I, as my personal identity, is unclear, and the qualifying noun Black no longer refers to something explicitly defined. I am not Black is obscure.
So Anwar, do you want to ask a question or comment on?
Yeah, okay. So as I was reading and thinking even more, it's of course it's such a great exercise to read aloud. Um, so of course, when we're thinking of when I asked earlier about like whose phenomenology, of course, it automatically makes me think of the Cartesian model of I think, therefore I am.
Mhm.
I centering I, the universal European I, right? And then that just notion of like, when we think of Cartesianism on a mathematical sense of that Cartesian plane, right? Which automatically makes everything flat and linear. Even if you use like a parabola to like create arcs, it's still on a 1/2 dimensional plane as opposed to a 3 or 4 dimension, which automatically um, creates a different I. And
Yeah.
so to push back on I am not Black. And then, of course, I thought about your conversation that you had last time about like, just because I am not this does not mean I am not something, right?
Right.
So that notion of, where do you put, ambiguousness as to be nearly unintelligible. So I guess because of the ways in which the non-white subject in particular is constructed, that ambiguity not only makes it unintelligible, but beyond recognition. So I guess what I want to think about or ask is, because of that non-recognition or just unintelligibility, can there really be an I outside of this Cartesian notion of I? Like, can there really be an I outside of that imagination, or that white imagination in particular? So I think that's what I'm asking. Like, can there really be this thing to start?
Okay.
It
Can you
looks
hear
it
me?
looks like there was a power cut for a second,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, you need me to repeat?
Yeah, yeah.
Did you
It
hear?
definitely happened.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, I heard the question though.
Okay, great.
Um, this makes me think, man, like, cause I'm in a 4 session, a 4 class session that's been taking place over the past several weeks, discussing Frank Wilderson's work, and I haven't been able to read anything, so everything that I know right now has just been from the group's discussions of his work. Um, but the sense that I got from those discussions was that Wilderson's sense of Afro pessimism wants to be able to sort of invert the sense of empathy to the point where the black subject cannot be empathized with by white subjects or really anybody else. So there's just, by putting the black subject in this place and letting everybody sort of feel the burn from this, it's almost like he's allowing the black subject to exist in a place of absolute sort of recognition in their own right, but without the possibility of healing with their environment between everybody else. It's like he just wants you to, like, I want you to feel all the shit that we've been through, and you not be able to say anything about it, and you're just gonna feel this pain, and that's what it's gonna be, from now indefinitely. So I know that's a little bit of a simplification, um, but I would say within the context of what we're saying, um, some peripheral thoughts that I had, regarding anonymity and what anonymity means within the realm of signification. Um, what I'm talking about is not what Wilderson is talking about. So, anonymity, the way that I think about it, has certain advantages. So, when a thing or a subject cannot be identified, when no significations stick to it at all, or when any imposing attempts to signify just absolutely fail, um, that's very anxiety provoking. And we encounter these things every day. If you come home and all the lights are off at your house, and you know they were on before you left the house, you don't know what's in that house. So there's an aura, in essence, of anonymity within your very familiar space. But in terms of identity, what anonymity means is that I can't I can't place you. I can't even use language to speak on you. I can think things in my brain, but as soon as those thoughts move past my mouth, they're just they're just out there and they're floating and they're not being productive. So being an anonymous subject has the ability to sort of escape language and signification wholesale. But this does come with a price. It also means that in a Lacanian way, you are outside of the symbolic order, which means that you also cannot participate at the level that everybody else does, because they're playing the game of signification. So you can't be an anonymous subject and participate with everybody else at the same level, because they're already invested by incurring certain costs and doing the cost benefit thing, while you are sort of outside but trying to be halfway inside at the same time. So you're trying to live within the gap of the two worlds. So I guess in the Lacanian sense, you're cut from the name of the Father. Um, so what I'm trying to do is not necessarily go all the way to the point of anonymity. I'm just sort of trying to go halfway. Going halfway, having one foot in and one foot out, is enough to be a problem to allow me to sort of circumnavigate and circumvent these projections that other people are trying to put on me. So, um, so that's sort of what I'm trying to lead to. Um, I brought in Marshall McLuhan, man, because I'm good friends with Andrew McLuhan, which is Marshall's grandson. Um, and in reading his work, it's really been informative to me. Just how he conceives of media and the medium and what that means in a more global context, but also um, what that type of relationship means between the subject and the environment, and what mediation means between. So when we talk about the medium as the message, he typifies that statement to mean the effects of the medium are more important than the content. So, with regard to language, we could say the effects of language are more important than than the content of language as specific words or phonemes or the sentences and all those types of constructions. So the greater effect of language, um, I mean, you could really scale that. So in this sense, the effect of language, one of the effects of language could be the way other people signify me in the context that we're talking about as a Black subject. So one way to think about the medium and the messages, without that particular medium, would that effect still be there? So if I take away language, can I still be um, subjectified and contextualized and commoditized in that same way?
So
So
let me ground that question for a second.
right,
Uh, so the statement "I am not black," I feel like with this essay, what you're trying to explore is the effect of that statement, and you're
yes,
less attached to the content of the statement. I think a
correct,
lot of people reading it will be hung up on the content of what it actually means to say that.
yeah,
And that's
yeah,
why I asked you last episode, obviously, uh, that would be like the mis the main misreading. But you're interested
Yeah,
in uttering that statement to see what kind of effects it would have, and then you're exploring those effects in your writing. And
absolutely.
I think this is what you're doing. So great. At least that's. So one question I have in relation to something Anwar said regarding, the cogito ergo sum, the famous, statement from Descartes, I think therefore I am, which is basically a statement about equating thinking with being, which is obviously Anwar was showing that the I is the universal European I, uh, but also this equation of thinking and being is, one, is idealistic, and two, a lot of people can get there because of the way history has unfolded, right? um,
Right.
and so it's a very privileged position, in other words. And so, interestingly, yesterday I was working on a paper that looks at engaged Buddhism and critical psychology,
Hmm.
and there are some parallels between engaged Buddhism and psychoanalysis. Specifically, this statement, I don't know if you've heard of Thich Nhat Hanh, he's a Vietnamese Zen master, but
Hmm.
he famously critiques Descartes and he says, I think, therefore I am not.
Okay.
So
Okay.
basically, he's problematizing the equation. So he's thinking thinking does not equal being. And Lacan said the same
It's such
exact
a Buddhist
statement.
response, by the way.
And Lacan said the same exact statement. Lacan said, I think, therefore I'm not. So imagine, he's
Yeah.
coming from a psychoanalytic perspective. This guy is coming from a Buddhist perspective. They both uttered the same exact statement, which is problematizing, the whole Cartesian project, which is about centering the European ego, basically, right?
Yeah.
Um, and there are other authors, like famously Ramon Grosfoguel, he writes about how this ego cogito is based on a conquering ego. Like, we tend to forget that if you look at when Descartes was making that statement very comfortably from his home, probably. Well, think about the history of the colonization of the Americas and the transatlantic slave trade as a context for that statement, right? So he's
Hmm.
not just making a statement in a vacuum. Uh, he's making a very specific statement about who the ego is based on this conquering ego that took place before, right? So
Yeah.
that's kind of like the theoretical buildup. So I'm not black. It's a way of saying I think, therefore I'm not black. So you're, in a way, you're problematizing uh, the Cartesian statement with that. That's I think Anwar was pointing in that direction. I tried to kind of riff off that with the things that came to my mind. So in a way, what you're doing is kind of an anti-phenomenology or post-phenomenology or something like that, right?
Yeah.
Mm. We could, I mean, I suppose we could categorize it that way.
Yeah.
Um, I guess for me, the closest thing would be to sort of just go back to Graham Harman and flattening the ontology of being. So I think subjectivity has strong proclivities to want to ground itself as as a core. I mean, which is essentially what a coordinate is. A coordinate is a very it's a particular location with great specificity, but at the same time, it exists within a matrix of an infinite number of other specificities. So it wouldn't make any sense for this coordinate to necessarily say that it's nothing or I'm just, any other coordinate. Um, I mean, the coordinate is very specific and it wouldn't be a coordinate without that specificity. But at the same time, that doesn't necessarily mean that it, in terms of being, that it's more than or less than. It's just a different type of specificity.
And I'm glad you said nothing, because that's a whole argument in Buddhism about the confusion between nothingness and emptiness. So maybe
Mm,
you can talk about emptiness, which is different from nothingness, because emptiness, in a way, is talking about interdependence and relationality. And
mm,
another key word, actually, I forgot to mention this because Nick Estes, I don't know if you're familiar with his work, but he talks about kinship as being the structural element that, like, being native or being indigenous, it's not about genetics necessarily. Okay? A lot of times we get caught up in that, this biological reductionism, which is a function obviously of scientific racism. But kinship, relationality, a relational ontology, right? This also challenges the Cartesian ego, who is isolated, individualized, right? The kind of ego that we see in psychology being central, my field, right? But it's there in philosophy from before. So yeah, emptiness as opposed to nothingness, right?
What is nothingness in the way that you're referencing mean in Buddhism?
So there's this confusion in the way continental philosophers read Buddhism, especially going all the way back to Hegel.
Okay.
So basically, someone like Zizek, he looks at Western Buddhism in quotes as ideological. And I see some of the critiques, especially the way the capitalist class uses, mindfulness and all of that. But what he doesn't do, he doesn't go back to the Buddhist sources themselves and the text to actually take those practices and theories seriously, which is what I try to do, right? So he just critiques it based on the way Hegel used to critique it when he didn't have access to a lot of sources, right? So whatever he had access to, he had this view basically that ultimately these other traditions, those non-European traditions, it's kind of this typical Eurocentric approach, which is like basically the non-European traditions are cool, but they're ultimately religions and they're not as sophisticated as our philosophical system in Europe, which goes back to the Greeks and all that whole story, which, a lot of philosophers today still like believe in this, right? I mean, let's be honest about it, right? So it's not engaging with Buddhism seriously as a sophisticated and complex philosophy and practice and all of that. And so the common misreading is to say that emptiness is nothingness, and basically reducing the whole system to zero because it's like based on nothingness. So it's a nihilism, right?
Yeah,
Whereas
it's
obviously,
the existential notion of nothingness is what you're getting at, right, Robert?
excuse me, say again.
It's outside of the existential aspect of
Yeah,
this, right?
exactly. It's
Yeah,
outside of that.
it's way
And
more complicated and nuanced.
I think the way I see it is that it's really trying to account for complexity, and complexity is not the same thing as nothingness or zero, right? Complexity is to talk about how things how it's to talk about interdependence, to talk about relationality, to talk about kinship, solidarity. These are different words for the same idea. Um, and maybe even chaos theory and complexity sometimes. And so Buddhism really, I see it as trying to address that, but it's reduced in Western philosophy to the zero, to the nothingness, because they don't want to. So in other words, the not in your statement could refer to emptiness, which is the way how I'm reading it, or it could refer to nothingness. You're not saying that you're nothing.
Right.
And that was what he was making that point earlier.
Right.
You're saying that you're empty of what people impose upon you, all the stereotypes that society imposes on you, how, slavery in a way, it's a historical reality. But it's also a discourse that's imposed on you that you didn't live personally.
Right, exactly.
But there's that disconnect, that, right? So in a way, you're delinking those things.
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm contesting the content. So I'm taking that content, I'm pulling that out and saying, I don't like this shit. I'm putting that to the side. But at the same time, what is still left is still, so I can choose to leave my own container, my own being empty if I so choose. And I can still be and operate who I am with that emptiness. Now you may not be able to speak on it because I haven't chosen to articulate and present it to you um, in a way that makes sense, that's intelligible. But I can still live my truth and be in the world as a subject with no problem. Um, so that's definitely yeah, that's an absolutely critical point. I can choose to have no content, no communicable content, if I so choose, and still be a whole and complete subject. Um, yeah, and that's part of the point of being half in and half out of signification. You know, to deliberately compromising the imposed narrative um, by taking the content and sort of doing the Neo at the end of Matrix One when they shoot the bullets and he holds his hand out and he stops, and they just fall.
Right.
That's what I'm doing.
So
That's
you're
exactly
hacking.
what I'm
You're
doing.
hacking. You're hacking the system.
Yes.
You're hacking the matrix.
One hundred
Love
percent.
that. I love that. And I'm watching Mr. Robot these days. So I'm like all in on this.
Oh man.
So should I read the next piece?
Sure.
Okay. So what is black? I go further still by asking myself, what is a class or set? The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy describes them as well-determined collections. Taking the question a step further, what is a class or set of black people? Two important events are occurring in this statement. In one instance, we are witnessing the phenomena of metonymy within language, whereas Colton Covesis puts it, we use one entity or thing to indicate or to provide mental access to another entity. In another instance, the limits of classification have been reached as an extension of Russell's paradox. Russell's paradox is in simplified terms, describes a set that is both exterior to and a part of itself. Further, radicalizing the question, I can say, who is the most black person? And witness the fruits of my metonymic labor. The descriptive quality of such a subject cannot be performed without using words with affiliated attributes. Beef is meat from a cow whose lean muscle provides sustenance for culinary delight and enjoyment. All the words in the previous sentence either deal with the cow's body, food preparation, or the enjoyment from eating food. Inevitably, no word or concept used to define black, and those words also need definition. Um, um, Words other than black must be used to define black, and those words also need definition. Inevitably, no word or concept can be absolutely and concretely defined in itself, but must be described through and in relation to other words that are often already associated with the concept. Arbitrary, artificial limitations resulting from the interdependency of signifiers, or the emptiness of signifiers, and their meanings are always pragmatically set by the dominant paradigm, the symbolic order. The most black person is impossible to empirically know because the foundation of what constitutes a black person also cannot be absolutely defined.
Yeah. So you guys know what Russell's paradox is, right?
Hmm.
Okay. Well, for those listening, Russell's paradox is a phenomenon within set theory discovered by Bertrand Russell, which sort of, as I said, it problematizes or highlights the nature of um, a particular mathematical phenomenon. Now, those details, I'm not a mathematician, so I can't even articulate the mathematical details of that. But one way that this is spoken about is through the sort of infamous barber's paradox. So there is a barber who cuts those and only those who don't cut themselves. So the question here is, who cuts the barber? So if the barber is cutting everybody else, then he's not cutting himself. But if the barber is getting cut, then he's part of the group getting cut. So the question of whether the barber is part of the group or not part of the group uh, is sort of the highlight of this paradox. Um, and this had been a thought like roaming around in my brain for a while. And this was related to questions that I had regarding what qualifies um, group alliance. So when we casually think about groups, so I mean to go back to politics, we can think of Democrats and Republicans, just to keep it simple. On a very realistic empirical level, if we were to say all Republicans or all Democrats were the same, it would be a little foolish, because obviously everybody in that group are individuals. There's individuals in that group, and they all have different things that they like, and different personal idiosyncrasies and things of that nature. Now, our simplification of reducing them to that label is to say that they all gravitate to this particular element or um, point of specificity. And that may be true, but to the extent that that is true, what does that also mean about the set of who they are? If that's the only thing tying them together or linking them together as a set, what does that say about all of their other qualities that they inhabit? All the more so, um, what does it mean for each of them to possess that quality, and how is that specific quality qualified in relation to one another? So if we say that they're all Republicans, can we also say that some of them are more Republican than others? So when we get down to the qualification and the quantification of that, then in the way that we have to simplify things as human subjects, because we don't deal well with great complexity, um, we have to. This means that we have to scale down the bit rate if we want to bring like a musical example to it. So we're not at 320 kilobits for music. We're all the way down to 96, which means that the quality of music that we're listening to has been greatly degraded when we simplify. So posing this question is a way of accepting the radicality of heterogeneity. That's what I was trying to get to by bringing in Russell's paradox to this uh, to this discussion. So when we accept radical heterogeneity, which is not really radical, it's just the state of things as are, um, then we have to accept that we reduce and simplify as a matter of fact because of who we are, and the consequence, the effect of that uh, content of reduction means that we sacrifice certain things. So when we want to talk about group affiliation and what it means to be a group, then we also have to realize that we can say that, and that we also have to accept the consequences of what that means, and also what escapes the meaning of what it means to be part of that group. So, when you want to stereotypify and say that all Black people are the same, um, then automatically what you're saying, but also what escapes that stereotype. So, but I also want to say that this highlights a very particular kind of dynamic between um, like aggressor and the accosted. So as Black people, when you're put in that type of position by a dominant a dominant force, what that means is that you have to over determine and over identify sometimes um, with your identity. And then the consequence of that over identification means that you're automatically sort of boxing and constructing um, artificial categories around yourself in order to stave off significations from that dominant oppressor. Now, those categories become problematic because it means that you're attaching yourself to the signifier that you may not necessarily want to identify with, but you feel sometimes that you have to because it it helps the group, we could say, that it supports and unifies um, the the group in such a way that allows them to survive the assault that's coming at them. Um, so so empirically, sometimes what this means is that sometimes if you grow up in a particular environment and you feel you have to conform and do certain things just because everybody else is doing them, because if you don't, then not only are you left out the group, but those people who you decided to separate yourself from see then you as a threat within this group. So now they feel like they have to watch you, or even worse, do something to you because uh, you feel like you've decided to step away and you're no longer unified or feel like you're kin. So that so the kinship element becomes sort of overdetermined in that kind of a way. Now on the flip side, for the dominant force, none of those impositions are necessarily there per se to the degree that it's concentrated at um, for the other side, for Black people. So there's a looseness there. They can play with signification in a non-consequential way. They can even dip to the other side, to the Black side, like Rachel Dolezal did, and then jump back, as if nothing happened. Um, so, um,
Anwar, did you have a question or a thought here?
So it's just really interesting how, like, even though we're going through the article in this chronological linear way, we're actually going through in this interesting circuitous way too. So I was just thinking about that as well. But to get back to this notion of a paradox, it's makes me think of the a Star Trek episode, Who's Watching the Watchers,
mm,
where they try to create this anthropological experiment and create this like invisible observation deck, and then the technology wears off, and so the people they were observing realize, oh crap, outsiders.
yeah.
Uh, so so there's so there's that going on, and I've showed it when I was trying to teach critical thinking. But to think of, you use the political categories, and that's so funny because we're really questioning that right now. Like, what is a real Democrat versus what's a real Republican? Even though
Right.
there's like 10 parties in each party, to be
Hmm.
quite honest. So I just found it really interesting when you were talking about how that paradox kind of like creates a false narrative of the Black subject as being one dimensional.
Right.
It makes me think of Tommy Curry's work, how he talks about how does the Black male in particular go from this castrated and or Uncle Remus or Jim from Huck Finn kind of character that's like really flat, and at
Hmm.
most is just used as kind of like this breeding tool and then discarded and put out to pasture. Then emancipation, all that crap comes, and then he superimposes this hyper villain, this boogeyman, this hypersexual rapist or aggressor. So it just really makes me think about like that notion of kind of like the script. right?
Right.
Where like for a white subject, he, she, they gets to create, but also dismantle these identities, but then and superimpose these very toxic or problematic identities. Um, so that symbolic order, to me, in a sense, just reifies power. If
Hmm.
I think about it that way, right? So like,
Yeah.
is that what you're really ultimately teasing out? Is just that symbolic order as is just retaining a power that at best a non-white subject can mimic but never truly acquire. And if they do acquire it, it's just to retain and reify a white symbolic power. Is that kind of like where you're going with this in this paragraph?
Yeah, that can definitely happen. So there's a if you're going to be part of the symbolic order, then you have to deal with the consequences come that come with it. And part of what comes with it is that struggle for power, and signification is used as one of the tools for maintaining and exercising that power. So because we live in the world that we do, with blackness at a disadvantage in relation to the way power within whiteness is conceived, um, then that means to take back some of that mean to take back some of that is to push back in the fight, which I guess maybe as Wilderson would say has the consequence of almost a mandatory violence. Uh, Now, what violence means in that context could be any number of things. It doesn't necessarily have to be physical. Could be, violence of signification, violence of just being there. Period. Um, so so yeah. Um, Also in this paragraph, what's happening is, we're really digging into what it means for language to be in itself. So language, there's no real absolutes in language. Language is a matrix of, I mean, we could even go as far as to say that language is a matrix of conceptual subjectivities. So a word in a strange sort of weird way has to be defined by what it is not. So if we want to borrow from theology, we could say a word always has a cataphatic character defined by positive elements, and an apophatic character being defined by what it is not. So with those two components, um, whenever we utter a word or define a word, we always have to locate it or see where it's mapped within the cartography of other words, that is, in a more global sense, a linguistic environment. So we have four different words in the sentence "I am not black," but we also have to, in order to know what each of those words mean, we have to use other words to define them, and we have to sort of uh, relativize in a way. So by the time we construct our own sentence, of which that sentence is, I am not black, we have an understanding of what this sentence could possibly mean and point to a direction and pursue that direction um, of logic and sense. So um, yeah,
I
it
think,
sort of brings
sorry, go ahead.
no, so it sort of brings back that sort of age old question of which came first, language or um, something. I think it was posed by Rousseau. I can't think of the exact question, but But
I
yeah,
always ask that myself that question regarding dualism because I mean a lot of the paradox is based on the idea of dualism, either or, and the dualism itself could easily be false, right? So it's a
right,
dualism of sameness and difference, and to be um, in solidarity with a group doesn't mean that you're the same,
right.
right? So that there's a distinction there, but this is unrelated to what you're saying, but maybe related to some extent. I always think about because human beings think dualistically, as you said, like language itself is dualistic.
Mm,
That's how it's structured. To know what something is, you have to know what it is not.
right.
And that's how we. Now, of course, the problem is that, and we know this from colonial history, is that it's not just about difference of us versus them, self other, but it's also about hierarchy. And that's the question of power that Anwar was pointing to. That whenever you differentiate, you also raise something and lower something.
Right.
So that black is not just different from white, but it's also there's a power dynamic there. There's an asymmetry. Um, so having said that, I think Anwar was so spot on to bring in Curry's magnum opus, the man not, because ultimately, what are you describing except the man not? When you're saying
Mm,
I am not black, isn't
mm,
that basically an explication of the man not? And speaking of violence, because as a form of resistance, in this case, symbolic violence,
right.
violence at the level of language, violence at the level of logic, um, Paulo Freire characterizes the violence from the oppressed as radical love.
Mm,
Because what it does, it humanizes the oppressors and the oppressed in the process, right? It's the kind of violence that humanizes,
mm,
right? And that's, if you think about it, what is Tommy Carey doing? He is delinking from the whole project of Western philosophy, wants to build, black subjectivity from the ground up on its own terms, right?
mm.
And obviously, from the perspective of European philosophy, that's violence. He's being violent. But what is his violence in comparison to the violence of Europeans historically, right? So
Right,
the
right.
kind of violence that he is doing is the kind of violence that is, again, Freire characterizes as radical love because it's a humanizing violence. So, of course, if you are working from the premise that you see the other as, subhuman or non-human, so when they're fighting for the humanity on their own terms, obviously you're gonna make sure that it doesn't work, right? So this is basically what's
Yeah,
going on right now in the field, right? The kind of the nonsense struggles that we see on social media and the kind of silly backlash that his work gets, um,
yeah,
but I see some connections here. I think Anwar pointed to that connection, and I think it's very powerful to kind of emphasize it. But before, just to make sure we get to more material, so I think Alfonso, you're next. Why don't you read the next two paragraphs so we can move a little faster?
okay. Um, Reduction and simplification are an essential part of human ontology. People also cannot control their futures from an omniscient perspective, leaving them open to contingency, what other people call fate. Complexity is impossible to engage without it causing cataleptic submission. Simplification works to subjectivity's benefit by allowing the world to be comprehensible at the cost of sacrificing potentially important data, similar to how music data is encoded in relation to bit rates. How does this relate to the sub question, what is a class or set of Black people? Admitting that in order to set a precise definition of any word, arbitrary limits must be drawn, then it must be admitted that a class or set based on sameness or qualities between its elements suffers the same complex of pragmatic but reductive simplification. More problems arise in the acknowledgement that classification at any level is compromised by subjectivity itself. Phenomena do not simplify themselves for other phenomena. Signifieds do not simplify themselves for their associated signifiers. This is a trait done by subjectivity for consciousness to facilitate its unique perspective upon the world. Um, just saw a typo. Reality and fantasy are conventionally viewed as independent. Reality is founded upon the material world, and fantasy involves psychical conceptions beyond reality. However, interaction between the two can cause pleasure that adversely affects the subject. People often fantasize about the perfect partner. When a relationship is established, this fantasy can continue to operate until the partner over time reveals their own independent character detached from the fantasy. The initial excitement before the decline can be considered a form of jouissance, where the subject persists in perceiving their partner in an inauthentic way, delaying the inevitable truth that the partner is an entirely different person. Reality and fantasy are mediated by this enjoyment that turns on the subject, caused by their own unconscious desires. In the case of racial stigmatization, race serves as the gateway to fantasy for the racist and the racialized. Um,
Why don't we start with a question or comment from Anwar? Uh, that way, if there's something we want to highlight.
So yeah, these two paragraphs are really interesting because it makes me think about going back to anonymity again, where we know in current iterations of social media, for example, people can be anonymous uh,
mhm,
to push things to a more radical level of inclusivity, but also push things to a radical level of like all things supremacist, right? So like
right.
the infamous bot where it's usually image of a cat or a dog saying the most like racist things, right? But also like symbols of socialism or anarchy when it's pushing things to a radical sense, or the V for Vendetta mask, right?
Yeah.
So it does make me think of that. Um, but also that notion of like reality and fantasy in that, because you can live in this fantasy of seeming real or for the consensus, but it's really playing out one's fantasy when people hang out in these digital spheres. Because you
Mhm,
mentioned how you really don't sign up for being a part of the contract of a symbolic order.
mhm,
It's a mythic order, more so than a realized one,
yeah.
um, right? And so, and of course, there's that pleasure and jouissance of that as well, because we know there are people who are posing as like Black Lives Matter activists, right?
Oh yeah.
And they're really racist, right? Or posing as people of Arabic Muslim culture as well too, that as well, so, and other racialized or non quote unquote normative groups. So that's what it made me think of, that duality of reality and fantasy. Um, and so I say all to say, like, it makes me think, is being in your case, in your essay, non-black, is it really a fantasy, or more so than a reality? Too, right? Like that's a question of one
Mhm,
what also think of, because like uh can it really be a real actualized notion of pleasure, joy, and full embodiment, is really where my brain is thinking um, with these two paragraphs. So it's more so as open-ended question slash statement is where I am right now with that.
mm. Okay. You know what? I'll say this.
Mhm.
When I'm by myself,
Mhm.
I spend quite a bit of time, just by myself. Um, Man, I'll be real. None of these significations, you know, are even close to me. Um, the way the world is and views me and the way I view it. Once I step at the threshold of my house, you know, all of that is closed off. I'm just me and the way that I exist. I come in and I'll do the things that I like, uh, and just do me without having to define who I am. So I don't have to self-justify. That whole aspect is cut out. Um, but I guess maybe to stress the difference between reality and fantasy. I think for myself, reality they're both shifty a little bit. So I'll say that people can have everybody can have a reality, and this reality can be tied to something material. So for example, everybody that's alive lives in a reality. We all happen to share a materialisms and biogenetic structures that allow us to interpret the world so that we can um, do things. So in that sense, there's reality that is founded upon very material uh, foundations. But then on top of that, when we start to individuate as subjects, we all have our own specific perspective. And this perspective, it becomes slightly ambiguous to say whether it's real or not in terms of verification, because even though someone may be saying and communicating some things that might sound outlandish to everybody else, I can't concretely say that what they're experiencing internally as a subject is not real, because it it may very well be, but I can't inhabit that space. So in terms of fantasy, fantasy is more individuated, as opposed to necessarily being the stereotypical um, maybe the psychoanalytic perspective that it's just something that is ephemeral on top of the material reality that we all know and share in, with the stigmatization that it's negative. So fantasy could be positive, could be negative. It's sort of ambiguous, it slides in between a little bit depending on the context that it exists in. Um, so that for me is sort of the delineation between reality and fantasy. Um, but
If I may
I
add
don't.
a few words here.
Yeah.
Um, so I'm going to wear my psychoanalytic hat for a second. Um, I think of the distinction as between reality and the real, with fantasy being part of reality.
Mm,
So it's kind of like going back to the Matrix you referenced earlier. The
right.
Matrix is reality, which is basically a fantasy, because everyone thinks
Mm,
it's real, but it's like a computer simulation. But the real is that human beings are being enslaved and used as batteries to sustain this fantasy dash reality, right?
yeah.
So in this
Yeah.
sense, and this is kind of very Zizekian too, like fantasy is a structuring foundation of reality itself. And kind of the movie they live, right? You have to wear those ideology critique sunglasses in order to be able to see through the fantasy and see the real, which is disturbing because then you start seeing these aliens and all these messages behind the ads, telling
Yeah.
you to do things. So that's the kind of tension that I see there. That fantasy is actually, I see it as part of reality, and I see the real as being this traumatic thing that we cannot articulate. But yeah, so kind of going back to the Matrix.
Yeah, yeah, you're definitely right. I think as I move forward, I think I'm trying to get away from the word real and reality to a certain extent, only because there's so many people that define the word real in so many different ways. Between Lacan and Zizek and Francois Laruelle, uh, and Derrida and all these guys. It's like whenever you say real, especially within a French philosophical or psychoanalytic context, you always have to ask, okay, who's real? And then within that context, what does it mean?
Right, right.
So, um,
It's a trippy thing. I mean, it's like ontology, right? So,
absolutely.
um,
Yeah. Yeah, I
Yeah.
was thinking just like when you gave your experience of public versus private sphere also, right? Where you were talking about like
Mhm.
at home I can just do me, right? Like there's
Yeah.
no external force. I can just be in my space, right? Or as Robert mentioned earlier, the inter R. Like there is no
Yeah.
thing, but yeah, but when you add that notion of reality and fantasy, it's like whose notion of reality do I have to take on today? Or thinking of that kind of Du Boisian double consciousness, right? Where like
Yeah.
the only time I get to be me is in my private sphere, right? And even
Hmm.
then, it takes work to dismantle those external forces that want to impede on my notion of being, especially when I think of your last full paragraph of the essay too. So that was just my added on to that what you just said.
Yeah. It's funny you mentioned that, man, because I just read an article about I think it was about Kylie Jenner, and she was saying that she made a comment that she's sad that she can't reveal her real self on social media because I guess in the beginning
oh,
when when she started, she was being more authentic over social media and she was getting a bunch of flack. So as her following grew, she felt that she needed to put on more. So now she has millions of followers and people see a certain presentation of her, but she's outright saying in that article that that's not the quote unquote real her. uh and I guess she feels a bit isolated, that she can't have genuine interactions with people, and that when she does engage with people, they're engaging with that um phantasmatic ideation of her. And I can only imagine as somebody in the public eye like that, a celebrity or influencer, as they like to say today. Um, you're in between. You're in between, and I don't know what that does to your subjectivity. For having to endure that for so long. So if we want to talk about the extremes of double consciousness, you know, with my people, when I'm with my people, they're also inhabiting the same space. So if I'm with oh god, uh, cohort like the Kardashians, we're all living this shared reality. But when I'm engaging the world and when I'm engaging you, where is that split, or is there a split? Do I sometimes slip up? You know,
they share
yeah,
a reality TV.
yeah.
Right? I mean, honestly, her complaint is like white people's problems. Like, she's a billionaire.
I was
She should just like, she should just like not talk about this.
this
Like, there
this
are real problems in the world, you know.
right.
Authenticity. Like, honestly, I don't care about her authentic self, and her authentic self could be racist. Like, so yeah. So, but in terms of like, and we're close to wrapping up here because I don't
yeah,
want to take more of your time, but Du Bois's level of consciousness, what I like about that is he doesn't see it as a negative. He also sees it as a gift, like the gift
Yeah,
of second sight. So it's, which is related to empathy and compassion, right? It's again related to, it's more humanistic, right?
yeah,
Because people that don't have double consciousness are unable to imagine the experience of the other, and that's
Right.
why they're cruel.
Hmm.
I mean, ultimately, right? And people that have double consciousness, they have a consciousness of the other and of themselves,
Yeah.
right? And so they are able. Now it's exhausting, of course, because they have to keep moving back and forth between more than one consciousness, but it also it makes them more humane,
Yeah.
and that's why it's a gift, right?
Yeah.
So I want to end with the three paragraphs here. Anwar, do you want to read those three paragraphs, and we'll end on those final thoughts on that, and then we'll have to have a third episode to finish the last page. Yeah.
So starting with color blindness, right?
Oh,
I think the one that begins with "there is," isn't it from "there is a negatively
Oh,
excessive,"
oh, oh, I see
yeah,
it.
yeah.
and then all the way to the paragraph that has Jean-Paul Sartre in the beginning.
Gotcha.
Mm,
All right.
mm.
So
Before you do that, though, I just wanted to add real quick.
Yeah.
So to what you were saying, Robert, that virtuality of imagination, of being able to, see beyond one's own experience. You know, that's exactly what you were talking about. But also that double consciousness also has an anonymous aspect to it because I'm presenting to, um, the oppressor one side, and they do not know the other side. I'm keeping that from them, so that by preserving that anonymous aspect of myself, I'm also keeping a real part of myself to myself, but also um, sort of allowing in a virtual infiltrator into the oppressor space without their knowing. Um, and
Nice. I like that. Virtual
sort of,
infiltrator.
yeah. So I just
That's
want to
cool.
add that real quick.
okay, I like that. All right. So there is a negatively excessive jouissance, though, that occurs as a consequence of the subject simplifying the reality, fantasy self itself. Wow, I like that. Fantasy is now not just a mental event, but a mode of production, keeping the subject in a suspended state of unreality. Slavoj Žižek qualifies a fantasy as something that constitutes our desire and mediates between the formal symbolic structure and the positivity of the objects we encounter in reality. Sheldon George will go on to theorize the roles jouissance and fantasy play in the American conception of race. Quote, in American society, this fantasy object, I argue, is often racial identity, supporting both difference and jouissance inducing fantasies of being. Borrowing our acknowledgement of the heterogeneity of reality, I posit that each subject's epistemology functions on the basis of fantasy while grounded in a shared material reality. On this ground, and the required impulse for subjects to express their being in the world, subjective reality can become independent from the ground it is founded on. With this independence, however, comes an ethical imperative to use this independence wisely. Jean-Paul Sartre makes a salient point in his accomplished being and nothingness. The essential consequence is that man being condemned to be free carries the weight of the whole world on his shoulders. He is responsible for the world and for himself as a way of being. Oh.
Hmm. Yeah. Being in nothingness spoke to me, and continues to speak to me in a very particular kind of way. So when Sartre gave that imperative, when I first read it, I was like, man, that seems a little bit heavy. But then at the same time, um, I was I was more convinced that what this really means is that you know as a subject, I'm speaking to subjectivity as a whole and what it means to be a subject in the world. So, for a subjectivity like myself and those who may share in similar experiences, um, it's not that I'm having to, like the stereotypical example, being the only Black person in a room, of white people, it's not necessarily that I'm representing all Black people um, as a singular subject. It's that I'm showing that I have space too, so that me by myself having a space to enunciate and speak and be, it gives everybody else room to do the same as well and to be individuated in their essence. So by by allowing myself to have space here and to exist among all these others who might not want me here, um, I'm being a representative of what it means to resist that. And by being a signifier of resistance, I'm also allowing others to give way of their representation um, through me in a humanizing way. Um,
I love that phrase, by the way, signifier of resistance.
yeah, yeah,
By
yeah,
being a signifier of resistance.
yeah, yeah, and that's exactly what's happening with this questioning of signification by making it problematic. Being resisting the imposed uh, the imposed signification.
Mhm.
But yeah, so yeah, I brought up Sheldon George, man. Sheldon is
He's
awesome,
awesome,
and
yeah.
his book Trauma and Race is awesome. I feel
Yeah.
like
It's
everybody should
groundbreaking.
read that.
Groundbreaking, yeah.
Definitely, absolutely.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, we all play around with jouissance, with these negative tendencies of enjoyment, but definitely all the more the oppressor, and
Of course.
because without the oppressed, their identity starts to collapse, because
Agreed.
what do they have? What foundation can they build upon? Um, if
Es-
not for
Especially if they don't have anything, right?
exactly, yeah,
So
that is.
if economically, materially, they don't have much, and they get a lot of enjoyment from racism, right? So
Mhm.
that's a source of enjoyment for them. But
Absolutely.
you take that away, then they start thinking about their material conditions, and they might revolt,
Mm.
Hmm.
right?
This is true. Yeah, yeah,
I
this
mean,
is very true.
you think about the state we're in now, where they're forcing people to go back to work because it's going to threaten those powers' notion of being, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, this is so much to think about. My brain is going 90 miles an hour,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
that's
we can.
slow lane, but that's great. Yeah.
Oh yeah,
Right.
yeah, yeah. We
So
can
I'm
even
probably
talk about the.
gonna
Go
go
ahead,
ahead.
go ahead. No, I
Yeah,
was gonna
no,
say
go.
real quick the discourse around um heroes.
Mhm.
Our heroes at work, the frontline folk.
Yes. Yeah.
Um, there's all kinds of jouissance in there
Hmm.
because we know that prior to the situation and condition,
Yeah,
you know
and
that.
shout out to my wife, Coney, because she's one of them. She's an essential worker. So, I
Oh
mean,
man, yes.
I see the, the stress that it causes her on a daily basis.
Hmm.
Hmm.
I take her to work at 5 a.m. I pick her up, and uh, she's constantly exposed to people who are not only could possibly be carrying the virus, but also coming with attitude and being rude and
Hmm.
all those things, and it's just a lot to deal with. So yeah, there's a lot of fantasizing there. But what are we doing actually to improve the conditions for those essential workers?
Exactly. Exactly. We're not. What's not happening around this discourse is an increase in pay. I can tell you that for most of them, maybe for some, but for the most, mm-mm. And so we'll
Right.
see. If we ever get past this, if we ever get past COVID, um, we'll see what happens with this language,
Yeah.
and, in this discourse. Will it fade away, or will it stick around? And if it does stick around, will there be a paradigm or a parallax shift in how these subjects are viewed? You know, and all that sort of stuff. So it'll really start to show, you know, once we come back to some sort of normalization.
Yeah, there seems to be like some kind of real cut that happened, and we're wondering if there's ever going to be a return to normalcy,
Mm-hmm.
right?
And do
Yeah.
we
But
want to return to that normalcy?
the normalcy wasn't good anyways, right?
Right, right. I mean, the complaints department, I would say, especially around like April, May, of like, oh, I want to go back to normal. I'm like, you really want to go back to that normal? Like,
Right,
Mm,
it wasn't lit, you know?
right.
yeah.
Take the martinis away and it sucks, right?
Well, I mean, you see it even with the election. Like, I mean,
Yeah,
Biden represents the return to some kind of normalcy within the system.
right.
But there's no sense of like exploring any kind of radical alternative. Like, that's not
Yeah.
even, I mean, that was partly explored, but it wasn't definitely fully explored. It's not an option at this point.
No,
Yeah.
no, yeah.
Yeah.
So,
It seems like it's either going to be, you know, a very aggressive radicalization in terms of disparity and scarcity, or a huge repression represented by, you know, sort of, you know, the Biden camp. So yeah, I don't know. It's dangerous either way, but we definitely need to get Trump, you know, the hell out of there and see what we can do, at least with a Biden situation, to sort of to try and turn that around as much as we can to construct a new type of global subjectivity, you know, in the world. So got to make that happen ASAP.